All right, so in our lesson so far, when we've been looking at environmental justice, there's probably seemed to be um, a lot of potential connections between the environmental justice movement and the mainstream environmental movement. That they have a lot of the same kind of goals, same kind of villains that they might go after, and so environmental justice is just kind of expanding the range of concerns that we might bring to the table when we're dealing with environmental issues. And that's true in a lot of cases. There are a lot of cases where, if you've got a toxic waste dump going in, you might have mainstream environmental organization concerned that, it's going to leak pollution that's going to destroy fish habitat, and then you have environmental justice concern that that leaking pollution is also going to harm the water supply for a low-income black community, and so that's you can work together to block this toxic waste dump from going in. But I think it's also very important to understand that the environmental justice movement also has a critique of the mainstream environmental movement. That there are cases in which environmental justice and mainstream environmentalism can clash. And so it's not just a matter of broadening environmentalism to incorporate environmental justice, but it's also seeing how the activities of the mainstream environmental movement can themselves create environmental injustices. So it's not just things that we might think of as bad for the environment that can be environmentally unjust, but that things done in the name of environmentalism can also be the source of environmental injustices. So in this lecture, we're going to look first at the demographics of environmental concern, who is concerned about the environment. Then we're going to look at issues of representation and agenda setting within the mainstream environmental movement. Then we're going to look at the topic of outdoor recreation and how people of color fit into that, and then wrap up by talking about clashes between conservation and people who live in the landscapes being conserved. So we start out with the question of, do marginalized people care about the environment? There's a widespread stereotype that marginalized people in general and people of color in particular don't care as much about the environment as white people do. And this idea is based on a sort of a oversimplified version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Right? So this is a theory you've probably heard of in general terms, right? That people have this sort of hierarchy of needs, and if you haven't met your more basic needs, you don't worry about the needs that are higher up on that hierarchy. And in psychological terms, that's actually a really questionable theory. People don't have a nice strict hierarchy of needs like that, but it's kind of seeped into the public consciousness. And so there's this idea then that people who are marginalized, people who are in tough circumstances, aren't going to worry about something like the environment. They're going to be focused on more immediate material needs, like a job that's going to pay them enough so that they can make rent this month and put food on the table, and so forth. And so in this framework, the environment is this kind of luxury good that people only start to worry about. Do we have a nice, pretty environment after they've met their basic material survival kind of needs? But in fact, if we look at studies of what people actually say about their concern about the environment, right? If we ask people what they think about the environment instead of trying to guess it based on an outdated psychological theory, we find that people of color are as or even more, depending on how the questions are formulated, concerned about the environment as compared to white people. So there is plenty of concern about the environment from people of color. They don't see this as this luxury good that they don't have time to care about because there's more pressing issues in life. And in fact, that the environment can be a fundamental need. If your drinking water is poisoned, then that's a pretty basic need for you, right? And if people can see the connections of climate change, for example, to their lives, that's not some sort of luxury good that you're not worried about because you're dealing with other hardships in your life. That's something directly relevant to you. So surveys of people asking them about their level of environmental concern show that overall people of color and white people are similarly concerned about the environment. But there are some differences in exactly what people mean by being concerned about the environment, or what sorts of environments are people most concerned about. So there's a tendency among white people to emphasize things like wilderness, endangered species, global phenomena like acid rain, hole in the ozone layer, those kinds of things. Those kinds of environmental issues tend to get more emphasis from white people in these kinds of surveys, whereas people of color are more likely to emphasize close to home environments, the environments that you directly live in. And sometimes just the phrase that's sometimes used in the environmental justice movement is the places people live, work, and play. And so what this shows us here is that the agenda that we have within an environmental movement can shape whose interests are actually being served by that agenda. So if you have an environmental movement that is really emphasizing things like wilderness and endangered species and puts those as their central goals, that's going to be a movement that's going to be more appealing to a white support base than it's going to be to people of color that have a different sort of environmental agenda that they're concerned about. And when you look at those two sets of, drawn in very broad strokes, these two sets of environmental priorities, and you think about which priorities historically mainstream environmental groups like the Sierra Club or the Audubon Society or the Wilderness Society, right, what agendas have they tended to focus on? Well, it's that first list. Right? That first list are the ones that the mainstream environmental movement has historically tended to emphasize, and for that reason you would see fewer people of color being involved in the mainstream environmental movement, even if overall levels of concern about the environment would be comparable between different racial groups. So when we look at who's actually in mainstream environmental groups, right? Who are the members, who are the leaders of those groups? We predominantly see white people involved in mainstream environmental groups, not exclusively, right? There are people of color that have been in both membership and leadership roles in mainstream environmental groups, but proportion-wise, right, as compared to the demographics of the country as a whole, white people have been really overrepresented. That we've tended to have a disproportionately white membership and leadership, and more so the farther up you go in these organizations. And so if you're doing the readings for this week, you're looking at a report that's now being produced every year that tries to assess exactly where do our mainstream environmental groups, our biggest and most influential groups in the United States, where do they stand in terms of the demographics of their leadership? And this report's been going for a few years, so they can try to find, are there trends happening? And it's only been a few years that report's been coming out, so I'm hesitant to point to any significant trends with that few and closely spaced data points, but hopefully those trends will go in a better direction, right? Diversifying these movements to match the country that they are serving, but these organizations aren't there yet, that they're still, leadership still dominated by white people. And when we look at how we tell the history of environmentalism, right, when we look at how we look at this as a historical movement and how it has shaped the United States, we see a history that's told in terms of white people, especially white men, and the things that they've done and the ways that they have tried to protect nature. And a thing that often gets overlooked, because these are often holding these people up as heroes, great Americans who have done great things, we often overlook the fact that many of the founders of the mainstream environmental movement were racist. They had very negative views of people who weren't white, and I've got two examples there, but you can find plenty more when you start to dig into the biographies of many of these kind of iconic founders of environmentalism. So you take John Muir, so the founder of the Sierra Club. He was part of that classic debate about conservation versus preservation in the beginning part of the 20th century. And so he's this kind of hero of wilderness conservation. But in his writings and things that he said, he talked about indigenous people as being dirty and uncivilized, and wanting to get them out of the wildernesses that he wanted to preserve. He didn't care about them as people that had a relationship to that land, because he saw them as lesser than white people. He called black people lazy. Also did not see them as people that would benefit from the wilderness that he was trying to preserve. So one of our most important and largest, most influential environmental organizations being founded by someone with some really problematic views about race. And then if you look, another organization founder, John James Audubon, right, who's the namesake of the Audubon Society, another really important mainstream environmental organization, he was a slave owner. So he, believed certain people could be, owned by other people on the basis of race. So not a great thing to have in the founder of your movement. Kind of sets you off on a bad foot there. So, like I said, these Muir and Audubon aren't unique in this way. Lots of the major figures in the history of the environmental movement were racist and created a movement that was a predominantly white movement focused on the environmental interests of white people. And then the flip side of this is that the history that we tell of the environmental movement then tends to ignore contributions made by people of color. So when people of color did things that were significant to our relationships with the environment, they get written out of that history. They get ignored by the environmental groups that are trying to, preserve our environment. They don't look at, or connect with these people and their achievements. So I've got two examples here of people that aren't often talked about and certainly aren't made central to conventional tellings of the history of the environmental movement. So the first is George Washington Carver. And so, most people know his name, but most people are always like, oh, he's the peanut butter guy. But he was a lot more than the peanut butter guy. What he really was a pioneer of organic farming. So he was living in the generation after emancipation. And so, he was looking at the relationship that his community, right, the black community, had with the land that they were living on and farming. And this was a very difficult relationship. This was a relationship that had been characterized for many generations by really intensive exploitation of both people and the land. Right? So we had a plantation-based system that was, of course, exploiting people because people were enslaved and forced to work this land without having freedom. And so you have generations of that really shapes how people understand the land that they're living on. They see it as connected to this really harsh history. And then it also exploited the land. So the plantation system, and in particular crops like tobacco and cotton, are really hard on the land. They would wear the soil out. And this is one of the reasons that there was such an intense debate about whether new states that were being created in the West would allow slavery or not, was because these plantation owners were having to essentially keep moving west because they were destroying the land that they were farming in the East. And they had to keep moving on to new land to keep their production up. So we had this really intensely exploitative relationship towards both the people and the land here. And what George Washington Carver wanted to do was to try to heal that relationship. He wanted to create a healthy relationship between the black community and the land that they were farming on. And so he did this by trying to create principles that we would today refer to as organic, ways of farming that would sustain the soil. And this is one of the reasons that he was so big into peanuts. And so he promoted peanut butter as a food because that would create a market for peanuts. And peanuts were great because they are a nitrogen fixing plant. So they restore nitrogen to the soil that gets used up when you grow lots of other kinds of crops. So if you rotate your crops with peanuts, then you're going to make your soil healthier. And so he promoted all the things you could do with peanuts to encourage people to incorporate those into their crop system. Right? So that's a real environmentalist agenda that he had. But you don't hear about George Washington Carver when you hear about the history of environmentalism in the United States. Right? He gets kind of written out of the story. Another example is Cesar Chavez. He was an advocate of farm worker rights. And so he was working with farm workers that were primarily of Mexican descent and advocating for them as sort of a labor movement, right? And that's the context he's often talked about, is as fighting for the labor rights of farm workers who were being underpaid and exploited by employers and so forth in the middle of the 20th century. But he also was very concerned about pesticide hazards to farm workers, that the pesticides that were being used on these farms were being applied in ways that they were affecting the health of farm workers. And so that was part of the agenda that he had. He also was an animal rights advocate. As well. So, these are all things that would connect him to environmentalism, but again, he's not a figure that gets a lot of attention when we're focusing on the history of environmentalism that's so dominated by these white figures like Muir and Audubon. So now I want to connect over to the idea of outdoor recreation, because that's very tied into environmentalism. And a lot of the reason that environmental groups talk about wanting to conserve nature is to provide opportunities for outdoor recreation, and that recreational use of nature is sort of held up as a good thing as opposed to, exploitative use of nature, right? We want to keep this forest as a place for people to go hiking, not tear it down to log it or make a mine there or whatever. Right, so there's a strong connection between outdoor recreation and environmentalism. But outdoor recreation is historically a very white hobby. So our images of who enjoys the so-called great outdoors is very white. And there have been a number of studies that have looked at the imagery that's used in magazines and TV shows and so forth, and especially advertisements that are focused on outdoor recreation. So you look at, who is in the ads that you see in, say, National Geographic magazine. There's a lot of ads in there that are focused on outdoor recreation, that are appealing to the audience that the advertisers are hoping to get to by advertising in that magazine is an audience that they see as enjoying outdoor recreation. And you look at what kind of people are actually featured in the imagery in these magazines and shows and advertisements and so forth, and you find it is overwhelmingly white people that you see there. And that's been changing very recently because the people that choose these ads have heard about these kind of studies and have become kind of sensitized to this issue and are making this sort of really deliberate attempt to diversify the pictures of who we see in these. But that's a very recent change. So we have this sort of long historical baggage of the outdoors being presented as a place where you find white people, but not a place where you'd find people of other races, and in particular, not a place where you find black people. And then in terms of actually, engaging in this outdoor recreation, right? It's not just that there's this sort of distorted picture being shown in our magazines and stuff, but in fact that Black people are often less likely to be found in these outdoor recreation settings, and that is tied into a history of racist violence. So this is not just people, don't feel like doing that, it's not what they're into, but that Black people going into outdoor settings, especially in rural areas where the resident population is predominantly white, have faced for a very long time heightened risks of violence on the basis of race. And so that has discouraged Black people from getting involved in outdoor recreation activities. If they are going to face hostility from the local people there, from other people engaging in recreation, from law enforcement, and so forth, it might not be worth it to get involved in those activities. And then that creates this kind of culture of those not being activities that people do. They don't have friends that do them, and so forth. And so I've got a quote here from a book by Carolyn Finney, who was 1 or 2 years ahead of me in grad school. And the book that she wrote here, called Black Faces, White Spaces, is a really good book about this topic. So if you want to get into this more, and so she talks about a lot of this research that's been done, and also her own personal experiences as a Black woman being involved in outdoor recreation. And so she kind of summarizes this issue. She says, whether drawing on ancestral memory, historical fact, or simply driving while Black in today's world, this knowledge forms an integral part of Black people's inner GPS and how they navigate white spaces. So you have this sort of collective understanding of the problems faced by Black people getting involved in outdoor recreation that shapes, she uses this metaphor of the inner GPS, right? Shapes what places people feel comfortable going to, and what places they feel steered away from because of these risks and issues that both in their own personal experience and the personal experience of their whole community over generations have experienced. And you see this reflected in the way that things like national parks go about describing their own lands and what stuff they emphasize in what they show to visitors that come to these places. So a lot of national parks have a lot of racism in their history. If you look at where that land came from before it was a national park and how it became a national park, right? Who has lived in that place before? There's this is the history of the United States we're talking about. There's going to be a lot of racism in there. And until very recently, a lot of national parks really steered away from acknowledging that. They didn't talk about the way that, indigenous people had been forced off of that land violently to leave it the uninhabited wilderness that it is today. They didn't talk about the slavery that had existed on plantations that were in that area that's now this national park and so forth, because they thought, oh, that's going to make our visitors unhappy, right? There are visitors who were predominantly white. They didn't want to upset them or confront them with something that was going to spoil their vacation, so they kind of brushed all that history under the rug. But then having that stuff not be acknowledged then becomes exclusionary towards people of color who come to this area and know that kind of stuff is in the history. And so to see it not acknowledged, or to see it briefly mentioned in a display and then kind of glossed over, becomes an alienating experience. If these kind of things are being deliberately played down, it feels like you are being told that you don't belong here, your history doesn't matter. So you have this kind of exclusionary presentation of the land and history by things like national parks. But there has been, again, in recent years, a push to shift away from that, to confront these aspects of history, to highlight them and make people aware of some of the kinds of things that make up the history of these public lands like national parks. So I have the example there, and I should move my face from it so you can read it. So as an example, the town of Icelandia in Florida is now part of Biscayne National Park in the Florida Keys. And so this was a historical black community. And the park has recently started to actually highlight that aspect. So you go to that park, you're not just learning about like the wildlife that lives in that area, but you're also learning about this human history. Who are some of the people that have lived in this place before? What was their life like? And so forth. So by acknowledging that there's this history of black people living in this area that's now part of this park, they make that the park's story more relevant to a broader selection of the public. So I want to kind of dig into a case study here uh, with respect to bird watching. So that is a outdoor hobby that is predominantly white. So if you look at who is involved in bird watching, it's disproportionately made up of white people that go bird watching. And so black people who do get involved in bird watching, or who do decide to take up this hobby, can face a lot of hostility from a variety of different corners. You have hostility from other white bird watchers who feel like you don't belong here, who assume that you don't know what you're doing, assume that you're out of place, don't connect with you in the community that you have with other bird watchers. You have other white recreationists, so other white people that are in the spaces where bird watchers are doing their bird watching, right? Because there's not really dedicated bird watching lands, right? You're doing this on areas that are open to the public for a variety of other things. Those other white recreationists can also exhibit hostility of various sorts towards black people that they come across who are bird watching. And then there's law enforcement. So if law enforcement comes across a person engaged in bird watching, if it's a white person, they're more likely to get the benefit of the doubt that they're doing something legitimate, that they're not seen as being out of place or inherently suspicious in the way that law enforcement often looks at black people who are out in these public spaces like that. So you have all of these sources of hostility that can make it more difficult for black people to get involved in a hobby like bird watching. And this particular case study got a lot of attention from an incident that you may have heard of. You may have already been thinking about this as I'm introducing this slide. In 2020, there was an incident in Central Park in New York City that kind of went viral because it was captured on video. So there was a black man, Christian Cooper, who is a bird watcher, who is out in the park, and he ran into a white woman named Amy Cooper, no relation, who was walking her dog, and she had her dog off the leash, and he asked her to, put her dog on the leash, which is the rule in Central Park. You have to have your dog on a leash, and Amy got so upset about being told that she was doing something wrong, that she started screaming at Christian, and she started threatening to call the police and tell the police that she was being threatened by a black man. She specifically cited his race as something that she would say to the police. So trying to invoke the fact that law enforcement treats black people more harshly than white people, and use that as kind of a threat against him. And he did an admirable job of keeping his cool while she was, threatening racist violence against him, essentially, right, by threatening to call the police and emphasizing his race in that. And so the video that he took of this, went viral, drew a huge amount of attention to this issue. There was a lot of backlash against Amy over this, and it sort of started this broader national conversation about these kinds of issues and helped to spark a number of programs that were designed to specifically support and promote Black people involved in bird watching as a hobby. So the most notable of those was the Black Birders Week that was organized by a woman named Corinna Newsom, who's an ornithologist and bird watcher who is Black, and she was in the first slide of this presentation. I forgot to say that when I was back on that first slide. That's whose picture I had up there. So she organized this week that was kind of, an awareness week. There was a hashtag on Twitter, lots of people posting their pictures and so forth to promote the idea that birdwatching should be a hobby that people of all races are able to engage in without having to worry that somebody is going to, try to call the police on them or something like that. And so let me move my head out of the way again there. So that's the case of bird watching, but these same themes come up with respect to lots of other outdoors hobbies. So one that I know a lot about is geocaching. And so some of you, if you've been in some of my other classes, you've heard me talk about geocaching. So it's a GPS scavenger hunt. So you get the coordinates to these geocaches, and then you follow your GPS and you go find them, and it's some sort of a little container that somebody has hidden somewhere, and you sign the log in it to show that you've found it. And sometimes there's like little trinkets that you can trade in them and so forth. And you can place geocaches all over the place, and so there's lots of them in outdoors areas. Parks and game lands and so forth. You can go find these geocaches. So I've been doing geocaching for about 8 years now, and I've met a whole bunch of other geocachers while doing it. We sometimes have, in-person get-together events pre-pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic. And sometimes you run into people, like you go to this geocache and there's somebody else there also finding it at the same time. And I've watched lots of YouTube videos about geocaching and listening to podcasts and stuff. And nearly every person that I have encountered within geocaching has been white. The number of people of color that I've encountered as geocachers is infinitesimal. And it makes sense for the same reasons that birdwatching is a predominantly white hobby. Geocaching is as well. And in fact, I had sort of a personal run-in with this when I was showing geocaching to a friend who is Black. And so we went out and we found a few geocaches together, and she was pretty excited. She thought this was a really cool hobby. It's so neat that there are these like hidden things that other people wouldn't see as they went by, but you can find them with this app and so forth. So she was pretty into it the weekend that we were hanging out, and I introduced her to the hobby. About a month later, I messaged her and, we're just making conversation. I asked, have you been out geocaching again since that weekend when I showed it to you? And she said, well, no, because I stopped to think about it. And I realized all it takes is one person to see a Black person like rooting around in a bush or going behind a building or something and decide something suspicious and call the cops, and then that's it. I'm potentially life ruined there. So she decided for her own safety, it was a cool kind of hobby. For her own safety, she didn't feel comfortable continuing to do it because she knew that just the fact of her race was going to cause white people that saw her to be more suspicious, right? Give her less of a benefit of the doubt. And if they ended up calling law enforcement, which is the thing that sometimes happens when you're geocaching, is that people don't know what you're doing and the police see you or get called, that the police would be less likely to give her the benefit of the doubt in a situation like that. So she decided it wasn't worth it. And that contrasts with my experience that I have run into the police a few times while geocaching. And it's sometimes a little nerve-wracking, but ultimately I haven't had a problem. The police have understood what I was doing, and even if they didn't like it, they let me off with a warning. They were just like, all right, well, why don't you just move along? So the fact that I'm white has protected me from some of the consequences that someone of another race might have more reason to fear in that situation. And I've got a citation there to a blog called Geocaching While Black that's run by a guy named Marcellus Cad. And so it's mostly just a blog about his geocaching experiences, right? About how excited he is to find certain cool geocaches, and he's doing this thing where he's been trying to find at least one geocache in every county. He started with Texas where he lives, and he completed that, and then he moved on to some other states. So a lot of it's just like his geocaching adventures. But as you read it, you hear a lot about how his own race plays into how geocaching, his geocaching experience is. That he has to think about these kind of things while he's out there, either by himself or he has two daughters that he takes with him sometimes. That he has to be really aware of the way that in the places that he's going, that law enforcement and white passerby might have this heightened suspicion of what he's doing. He's gotten pulled over a bunch of times by police when he's just driving through these random rural counties in Texas looking for a geocache. Pulled over just because the police saw a unfamiliar black man passing through and immediately assumed something must be suspicious about him. So he describes these kind of experiences, and he hasn't been turned off from geocaching by this, but you can understand why other people might be if they had those kind of experiences. Then the other note that I've got there is an article by a guy named Omari Akil who talked about Pokemon Go and raised a lot of these sort of similar issues. So this was an article from a few years back when Pokemon Go first came out and was really big, and some of the those same issues of being out in public spaces and risking hostility from law enforcement and white bystanders. Akil experienced with Pokemon Go, just like Marcellus Cad found for geocaching, just like Christian Cooper found in bird watching. So this is a thing that extends across a whole lot of different kinds of outdoor recreation activities. Okay. Oh, myself there. Okay, so then the last thing that I want to talk about is something I kind of touched on it earlier, which is the potential clashes between conservation and people's livelihoods in areas that are being conserved. So the predominant model for nature conservation that has been promoted by the mainstream environmental movement that kind of grew out of national parks in the United States and has spread all around the world is to have an area where we're largely excluding people. And in particular, we're excluding extractive uses of the environment. We're excluding things like, farming and hunting and collecting goods from nature and so forth. So, people can be there hiking and bird watching and stuff like that. But these more intensive uses of the land are excluded from these areas. Right? This is kind of our paradigm for how we preserve nature is we kick the people out of it, basically. So that means that there's lots of people who have been kicked out of places to create conservation areas, national parks, and so forth. And in a lot of cases, those are, in particular, communities of color that are being excluded. So in the United States, we have lots of areas where Native Americans were pushed out of places to create national parks and so forth. And I have a note there that that was one of the reasons that our national parks were originally run by the U.S. Army. That was the federal department that originally oversaw the national parks. And a big part of that was because they were trying to keep the native people that they had kicked off that land out, and they viewed them as a hostile force, and so we needed a military occupation to maintain this as this unpeopled wilderness. You see it in places like Africa. There are a lot of the major national parks in Africa have been created by kicking out the African people that had lived in those areas previously and shoving them onto other land so we can have this conservation area that is free of human settlement for recreational uses and for conservation. And this is often tied up in assumptions about what it means for land to be unused. So a lot of times the rationale that's given for setting areas aside as conservation land is, well, nobody's using this land, right? It's unused land. But in fact, that land might actually be used, but just not in ways that the people with the power to set it aside as a national park recognize as legitimate uses. So if it's not, you're not cutting down the trees and farming and stuff, the land might be assumed to be unused. But in fact, it might actually be land that's part of the economic system of the people that live there. It might be land that is land for hunting and collecting forest products. It might be land that's lying fallow as part of a farm rotation, where you farm a land for a while and then you allow it to grow all the way back into a forest before you rotate around to that land. Again, that's a sustainable farming system, but it involves large portions of land looking unused to the eye of somebody that's used to farms where you farm the same piece of land year after year after year. So this misunderstanding of the culture and economic system of the people that live in a place can lead to areas being treated as unused when they're in fact used. And then you set that land aside as a conservation area, and you've now undermined the economy of the people that depended on that land as part of their broader economy. And even if we're not talking about, setting land aside and, removing people from land, conservation laws that limit what people can do to make a living off that land can have major negative impacts on the livelihoods of people that whose activities are being impacted by those laws. And so this is what has led to the concept, which is becoming a major concept in the environmental justice movement, of a just transition. So we need to make some sort of a transition between our current economic systems, which are causing all kinds of environmental problems, climate change being kind of the biggest, most prominent of those. We need to transition from this current kind of economy to a green economy, right? To an economic system that is not going to have these negative environmental ramifications. And so a just transition is one of these transitions in which people whose livelihoods are negatively impacted by the changes are going to be helped in some way to make this transition so that they don't lose out, so that we're not just cutting people loose and saying, well, sorry, tough luck, hope you can find a new job when we have, closed down the mine that you worked on, or radically changed the type of farming that you're allowed to do, or put a huge cap on the amount of fish that you can catch, and so forth. So we need a way to make sure that people's livelihoods are sustained, along with sustaining the natural environmental systems that we're concerned about. So a lot of these issues will come up again in our lesson in a couple weeks about the idea of wilderness. So I'm going to leave that there and see you in class.